So your group is spearheading some efforts to hold big oil accountable for the effects of climate change through litigation, which is, I think, a really promising avenue, especially because, and we'll get into this, Senate progressives agree with you. But just tell us a bit more about your work in this space and why you feel this is a viable path forward.
If you look through history, you'll see that no giant social problems like climate change have ever been solved without a litigation strategy. The climate movement tried for decades to, solve climate change through the Congress. They failed there. Now, the courts are not a place where you're going to solve climate change, but there are some things you can do through the courts that are really important. And the main one, we think, is to hold them accountable for their lying, right? The companies knew 40 or 50 years ago, maybe even 60, that their products would cause climate change. They called it catastrophic themselves. And then they ran the most consequential disinformation campaign in the history of humanity that put us in the situation we're in today. So we think that at a minimum, we need to engage the courts to hold the companies accountable for that. And that would mean that they should pay for the damages that were caused by their products, which they knew 40 years ago would cause those damages. And that could be anything from just sea level rise to, the catastrophic impacts of something like Hurricane Maria. So they need to pay up basically and be held accountable for that. And you can only do that through the courts.
And I mean, this is a very similar tactic to the DOJ under Clinton and Bush successfully suing big tobacco. So there's precedent for this.
Yeah, there is. And also all the state cases that were brought, the 40 some odd attorneys general that sued both the tobacco companies and the opioid companies is a really good example of this. Companies that lie about their product, they know it's going to kill people, just like the fossil fuel guys did. And then they were ultimately held financially accountable for that.
Right. So can you talk about how it got to the point where I guess it was on a few weeks ago at the end of July, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Markey, and Merkley, who are definitely, I think, considered the four most progressive senators, they wrote a letter to Merrick Garland asking if for him to go after Exxon and Shell and other big oil companies. Your take on that effort by Senate progressives?
Well, that's not the first time these letters have gone over to DOJ. That's the first thing to know. This is a sort of a one in a long series of letters and requests to the department to basically do what the department did to tobacco, as you said, file a racketeering case, against the industry, because it's clear that the industry orchestrated what is called, I guess we all know this now because of Trump, a corrupt enterprise that, for decades, spread disinformation about climate change and undermined the country's ability to deal with it. So what the senators and members of the House are requesting is that the DOJ take a similar action as they did with tobacco against big oil. The cases that have been filed to date, I should say, there's several that have racketeering claims in them, right? So there's a little bit of a precedent out there, if you will, where in New Jersey and in Puerto Rico, there have been racketeering cases filed. And what the members of Congress are saying is like, look, the DOJ is the most powerful law firm in the world, right? The largest law firm in the world. You'd be bringing the power of the federal government to bear against the companies here in what they feel and what we feel, is a pretty strong case that the companies engaged in a racketeering enterprise, to deceive the public about what their products would do and all the disasters that we see unfolding pretty much on a daily basis now.
Well, in the wake of what's happening in Maui, this would be an action that would make absolute sense. You mentioned that this is not the first time that this kind of letter has been written. Bernie Sanders and Ted Lieu, I believe, sent a similar letter to Loretta Lynch at the end of Obama's second term, trying to get them to look into big oil in this way. But if you could expand on some of those efforts by states and municipalities to sue big oil for the consequences of their actions and their cover-up.
Yeah, I think right now you've got 8 attorneys general and about 36 municipalities that have brought cases against big oil, basically saying they knew that their products would cause climate change, and then they lied about it. And so they've got to pay for the damage, right? They've got to pay for the adaptation costs that all these cities and states are going to have to bear as they attempt to survive climate change. The attorney general's cases tend to focus on the lying. They're more traditional fraud cases under consumer protection laws. The municipal cases tend to focus on the damages. In other words, look, we got to build seawalls and cooling centers. We got to expand the storm drainage. We got to move the sewage treatment plant. We got to protect our drinking water. We have this endless list of costs that we have. And we didn't cause this problem. You did, because you knew your products would do this 50 years ago. We didn't. Then you thrust this damage on us, and you need to pay to help us pay your fair share, if you will, to help us pay for these adaptations. And the thing about that is, and the reason the companies fear these cases so much is because if you think about the costs here, we're well into the trillions of dollars. I mean, if they were held accountable for their fair share of all the adaptation costs for every municipality and state in the country, this is an existential threat to them, and they know it. So, I mean, it's not only is it important morally, it's also, I think, in terms of, moving the nation forward, at least to get to the point where we can survive climate change. This is absolutely necessary because cities can't afford these costs. There's no way. There's just no way. If the oil companies aren't held accountable, a lot of these adaptation measures just won't happen.
What would be then the benefit of the federal government taking a RICO, a stance, bringing RICO charges versus fraud?
Right. So the thing that the Department of Justice can do that nobody else can do, first of all, they're not bound by a statute of limitations. So they can build a case that goes all the way back to the 1970s and 80s when the first evidence we have of the company's prior knowledge and initial deception has surfaced. So they can use the entire body of evidence to make their case. Now, they're not under federal RICO law. They can't get giant punitive damages or a multi-trillion-dollar damage award. They cannot do that. But what they can do is force the companies to tell the truth, right? They could force the companies to issue statements broadly, very widely, every time they ran an ad, for example, that said there is no climate safe fossil fuel, for example. Or they could, be forced to say that carbon capture, which is their latest fraud, is no substitute for emissions reductions. Or they could be forced to say that natural gas is not a climate safe fuel. There's a whole number of corrective statements that they could be forced to make, and essentially be forced to tell the truth, at a very wide scale, which would completely undermine their current ongoing greenwashing and general bullshit that they put out there about how they're, trying to solve the problem. They would be exposed as the cause of the problem and as perpetuating that through the lies that they've been telling. And I think that, were the Department of Justice to achieve those corrective statements, it would be a total game changer because all of the garbage that the companies put out there about how they're trying to solve the problem would be exposed for just exactly what it is.
Biden might have some explaining to do for his funding of two carbon capture projects, two carbon capture projects, and two more on the way. Right.
Well, I think, if DOJ filed this case, he'd have a pretty good claim to taking a very aggressive position against big oil. Not that the White House would be the ones that did it, but his administration would certainly, probably pick up a few points with people who care about climate if they delivered such an action.
Yeah, and I mean, we covered last night the Republican debate, and every single answer on climate change was an absolute just disgusting disaster about burning more coal, burning more oil. I mean, they revel in it. So that's not to say that a Republican would be any better by any stretch of the imagination, of course, but it is just something to note that, like, I would say that the Biden administration has been a little bit two steps forward, one step back in this degree when it comes to green lighting certain projects. Yes, the electric vehicle stuff is great, but this would be a stance that is appropriately aggressive, given or a step that is appropriately aggressive, given the scope of the problem that we're facing and that we're experiencing. And we have been for years, but very acutely this summer. I think more Americans are starting to understand what our future looks like.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Yeah, let's be clear that the administration has, let's just say, been all over the place on climate, right? So they do some good things, they do some things that, that are just plain, bad. But this action would, I think, go a long way to undermining the industry in a fundamental way if they were forced to tell the truth. Man, I just can't emphasize how important it is for the industry to be able to continue to lie and, gaslight the world about what they're doing. Their net zero commitments, which are complete BS, right? And everything else they say, carbon capture, all of that. It just needs to be exposed for what it is, and not just by, environmentalists or, people like me and you. If it's coming from the DOJ and it's coming from the oil companies, okay, if they're forced to say it, that's the game changer. So, I mean, that's the kind of pressure that this kind of litigation can put on the companies. And you really can't achieve that kind of result through any other means. There's the Congress is never going to do that, right?
Yes.
You can see that with opioids and tobacco. So the only way to get the truth out there would be through action by the Department of Justice.